Welcome in this video of the House of Asian Cinema. There is no doubt the Korean film industry has been the leading force of Asian cinema for more than 20 years now. Thanks to the presence of several generations of talented filmmakers, of a large talent pool of actors, of studios with strong financial backings, of a loyal audience and an aggressive cultural policy, South Korea has been able to eat above its weight and can project an impressive soft power. This increasing presence and influence see fans multiplying. They love K-drama, listen to K-pop and also watch K-films. But for most of them, there is a temporal barrier. These fans who discovered South Korean culture after 2000 are just not interested in what the country was producing before. In a way, it's like if a Hollywood fan chose to ignore John Ford, Orson Welles and Frank Capra. In this video, we will try to understand the reasons behind this phenomenon. For a long time, this disinterest for older films could easily be explained by one major reason. Most of these films were simply unavailable in physical format or with subtitles. Given the high productivity the Korean film industry has been able to sustain for more than 20 years, it was easy to just catch every new releases and not be bothered by what had been produced decades earlier. But things have changed, and nowadays many older films are available in physical format, and the Korean Film Archive has made available hundreds of films made before 2000 on its YouTube channel, most of them with subtitles. In only one click, a real treasure trove of cinema is accessible. And still, despite this newfound easy access, the current generation of Korean cinema fans do not seem to show a greater interest for older productions. Thus, the question of the availability cannot explain the phenomenon only, and its roots must be found elsewhere. Another factor which could explain why fans of modern South Korean cinema are not interested in digging deeper may simply be because most of the films made before 2000 are indeed inferior to their contemporary counterpart. Under the constant threats of its aggressive neighbor, under a military dictatorship for most of the second half of the 20th century, South Korean cinema had to deal for a long time with a stringent censorship. Very conscious of the power of the medium, the government used the carrot and stick strategy to control the studios and make sure everybody toe the official line. Unable to criticize the government or describe the country in an unfavorable light, having to emphasize the nationalist agenda of the power in place, especially when it touched on subjects linked to North Korea, producers and directors were competing with their hands and feet tied. Depending on the period, some genres considered safer were given priority: conventional war films, family melodrama, youth romance, Hong Kong martial art copies, or erotic films. In such a context, it's actually quite impressive some major filmmakers such as Kim Ki-young, Shin Sang-ok, or Jung Chang-hwa were able to appear and, to some extent, prosper, making some remarkable films. Because of this constrained production environment, many South Korean films from the second half of the 20th century were quite mediocre. But still, some good ones managed to be made. Unfortunately for the filmmakers involved, garnering international attention on their work was very difficult. Some Asian industries benefited from the passion and writing talent of people such as Tony Raines, Donald Ritchie, Tom Mess, or Bell Hogan. They have greatly contributed to the recognition of Japanese, Hong Kongese, and Taiwanese cinema worldwide. But comparatively, South Korean cinema did not benefit from such personalities able to publicize its historical dimension and gain more legitimacy. Writer Darcy Paquet comes the closest to such a name, but he already had his hands full with highlighting contemporary South Korean cinema. Festivals have also not done much for pre-2000 Korean cinema to be recognized. The first film to have been featured in a major film festival was Lee Byung-il's The Wedding Day in 1956 at Berlin. 5 years later, Kang Dae-jin's The Stableman got the Silver Bear in the 1961 edition of the festival. But these are exceptions, and very few South Korean films managed to be featured in international film festivals or benefited from it. Lee Do-young, for example, with his The Hut, shown in Venice in 1981, and Spinning Tales of Cruelty Towards Women, presented at the Cannes Film Festival in 1984, didn't get much attention from international critics and distributors. It's mainly Im Kwon-taek who encountered some success this way. Mandala was shown in the 1982 edition of the Berlin Festival, Kids Autumn a few years later in 1986. The following year, in 1987, his surrogate mother was awarded the prize for Best Actress at the Venice Film Festival. That could explain why, amongst all the South Korean filmmakers of his generation, Im has been the main one to get some kind of international recognition. The fact South Korea didn't have any major international film festival itself until the creation of the Busan International Film Festival in 1996 also contributed to this lack of awareness regarding South Korean cinema history and legacy. It's also easy to guess why most of the current fans show little interest for pre-2000 South Korean cinema by observing closely how modern Korean cinema has become so successful. The Hallyu phenomenon, this wave of enthusiasm for Korean popular culture, started at the end of the 90s thanks to the success of K-drama all around Asia. With the active support of the government and the chaebol, the Korean equivalent of the Japanese daibatsu, an authentic star system was set up. Music, TV series and cinema started stimulating each other to give birth to popular stars with a high commercial value. Their rise also led to the popularity of new beauty standards throughout the whole of Asia first and in the world in general now. Beauty standards and star power which were clearly different when you look at actors and actresses before 2000. At the same time, a new generation of filmmakers appeared. Those film lovers were nurtured by American, European, Hong Kongese and Japanese cinema much more than their own country's movies. They had been trained academically and embraced popular genre from police drama to action or romantic comedy. For this new generation of filmmakers, form is as important as the substance, and they have proved to be able to combine commercial imperatives and artistic ambition for a result more easily digestible for the general audience, both local and international. This increase in importance of South Korean cinema also benefited from the decrease of influence of the other cinema of the region. While Japanese cinema at the time managed to gather some attention thanks to the J-horror phenomena, the rest of its production struggled with international audience. Hong Kong cinema was in decline after a super productive golden age and was trying with much difficulty to reinvent itself. Nature abhors a vacuum, and so South Korean cinema development came at the right time to fill the void and to become the Asian cinema powerhouse, a status it still maintains now after almost 20 years. So, is it worth to discover pre-2000 South Korean cinema? Of course, the answer is yes. But you have to be aware that it is a cinema quite different from the one of the 21st century. Less technically proficient, less glamorous, less agile in using Western narratives and international cultural codes. It requires more effort to really immerse fully, but conceals many great films which will stimulate your emotions and intellect. Here are 5 films, one for each decade following the Korean War, worth seeing and which can serve as a good entry point in this cinema's exploration. A Flower in Hell.
뭐야? 응? 형.
Produced in 1958, the film follows Dong-sik, a former soldier wandering around in a Seoul slowly emerging from the devastation of the Korean War and looking for his brother. His quest leads him to the dangerous underworld of the city. Directed by Shin Sang-ok, who would become the most influential personality of South Korean cinema during the following decade, A Flower in Hell adopts a realistic style to describe the state of the country in a way that is reminiscent to what neorealism did in Italy. Even if the director digs into the underbelly of the city, he still manages to capture the humanity of his characters and leave enough room for his actors to give the best of themselves, especially Choi Eun-hee as the fascinating Sonia. Goryeojang. Kim Ki-young is one of the most prestigious South Korean filmmakers from the 1960s, thanks to films such as The Housemaid or Woman of Fire. Dealing with class issues and the conflict between tradition and modernity South Korea was facing back then. Goryeojang is an unusual work in his filmography, which is mostly contemporary, as this one is set in an ancient Korea. We follow a mother and her son who enters a wealthier family in order to survive the famine ravaging the country. But their presence stirs the jealousy of the 10 previous sons, who start bullying their adopted brother. With its studio setting and its beautiful black and white, the film looks like a dark fairy tale. The description of the filmmaker does of humanity is frightening, barely saved by the strong bond uniting the mother and her son. The March of Fools. The 1970s were the worst time for South Korean cinema, with studios under the complete control of Park Chung-hee's government and a box office in free fall. Caught between conservative love stories and repetitive drama, The March of Fools was a breath of fresh air, a gust of freedom in the small world of South Korean cinema. We follow two students in their everyday adventures and their discovery of love. Light-hearted, entertaining, but also illustrative of the repressive mood which was reigning in the country at the time, The March of Fools was a real struggle for its maker, Il-chung, who had to cut around 30 minutes of film to satisfy the censorship. Il-chung was considered one of the most talented directors of his generation, but he never got the opportunity to show the full spectrum of his talent, as he died in 1979 from a heart attack at the tender age of 38 years old.
예쁘게 생겼네요.
제 짝이 신 모양인데.
Seoul Rainbow.
날 믿어줘.
난 이제 널 믿지 않아.
The 1980s were a transitional decade for South Korea, with the dictatorship still asserting its power, even if on the way out. Still, filmmakers' expression got a bit freer, and some films started to touch upon some of the most controversial and painful memories linked to the military dictatorship. At the same time, the government initiated a policy of promotion of mass entertainment, emphasizing sport and sex, leading to the production of many erotic films. Kim Il-sung's Seoul Rainbow embraced those two seemingly contradictory facets of the industry. The main character, Yura, is a young girl hoping to become a star and who is ready to many compromises to reach her goal. But the political climate of the country will make her have to pay a heavy price for her ambitions. The first half of the film follows the classic storyline of the young and naive country girl corrupted by the materialistic city and its immoral inhabitants. A concept already treated many times in South Korean cinema of the 70s and 80s. But the film distinguished itself from the others by its fascinating description of the economic miracle the country was experiencing, and by the direct integration of the political issues in its second half, painting a very dark portrait of South Korean society of the time. Our Twisted Hero.
우리 학교 반도 안 되잖아.
그래도 이 지역에선 제일 큰 학교야. 빨리 와.
Adaptation of a bestseller from Lee Moon-yeol published in 1987, Our Twisted Hero follows Han Byung-tae in his trip back to his childhood town to be present for the funeral of his former teacher. He remembers his years at school when his class was under the domination of an authoritarian classmate named Sok-dae.
어때?
The film and book have two different degrees of analysis possible. On one hand, it is a touching school drama denouncing bullying with very convincing child actors. On the other hand, it can be understood as a metaphor of Park Chung-hee's military dictatorship. This later interpretation elevates the film one level higher, with its fascinating and complex description of such a system in which interests of the victim and their oppressors are intertwined in order to keep a status quo and an artificial stability.
저를 모두 버린 나는 하루하루 반을 걷돌며 기회를 노렸지만 괴롭게도 그 기회조차 쉽게 나타나지 않았다.
I wish you a good exploration of this other South Korean cinema, and I hope to see you soon on the House of Asian Cinema.